Move on to another one of our speakers. We'll be hearing from Dr. Sylvia Allegreto. Is a labor economist and a co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. Is a research center house at the Institute for Research on Labor Employment. Dr. Allegreto received a PhD in economics from the University of Colorado Boulder and worked for 7 years at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., where she is currently a research associate. Allegreto co-authored several editions of the States of Working in America, and the most recently authored The State of Work in America's Wealth in 2011. Please welcome Dr. Sylvia Allegreto.
Wow, I really want to be in a union. But of course I'm not. This has been so fantastic. I just love being here and hearing you do your business. It's so great. It's so wonderful to be in Canada. I'm a little embarrassed to say this is my first time in Canada. Right, I know, typical American. I have a good excuse though, I think. Even though I come from rural northwestern Pennsylvania, in a very small town of about 5,000 people called Ridgeway, Pennsylvania. It's only about 125 miles directly south of Buffalo. So I mean, I was this close like all my life. I had to come all the way from California this time, but never quite made it. But the reason is we had 5 kids in our family. My dad made a good, decent living. He's a painter, a minimum wage job these days in the States. But he is a proud lifetime member of the International Painters and Allied Trades. We were a proud union household. My mother spent 25 years in plants, in the factories. You might know that area of the States. We're very heavy in industry, very heavy in powdered metals and carbon plants. Even my grandmother spent over 3 decades as a proud union member in a carbon plant in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. So I'm really so proud to be here. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for all the help in getting me here. So I call this the wrecking ball. Does anybody know why? Wrecking ball, does it ring a bell? Well, we're going to be talking about him a little bit here today, but it's Bruce Springsteen's last album. I'm a huge Springsteen fan. His last album he kind of wrote in reaction to the Great Recession and the implosion of the American economy, called it the wrecking ball. So, as with Bruce Springsteen, he's been for about 40 years, right, making commentary through music and through his lyrics on what's happening in the United States. This idea of the American dream that is so tightly woven into the fabric of our lives as America. He kind of commentates on how true is that? How true was it? How true is it today? How has it changed? This idea of a meritocracy, that everybody gets a fair shot in the US, that class doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you start. It matters how hard you work. And if you work hard and you have perseverance, that you can make it in the United States. So this is the ideal that I start out with. And we're going to look at some long-term trends and some shorter-term trends as far as especially what's happened since the Great Recession. So, as an economist, I hope you're all ready for some, serious regression equations and some wage equations and some general equilibrium modeling. You got your thinking caps on? No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. That's crazy. What I will say is, let's start here. This is what I think the ideal is. This is what I think is happening in Canada, right? I think we have a system that is completely broken down in the US, but this is what I think the ideal should be, right? You have unions and corporations, and you have the economy that's cranking along, and the government is hopefully providing the oil to grease this big machine that's going on. So everybody's playing fairly by the rules, by regulations. Everybody's moving the country ahead together, that we are, in the end, everyone, the majority of people, as a people moving together as one. I will say that this is what I think is very out of balance and kind of what I'm questioning here today. Because the times are changing. They changed a long time ago in the US. And part of this talk is to point out what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years especially, and to make sure that you're not telling this story about your country 30 or 40 years from now. So, I don't know how familiar you are with some of these statistics in the US. When I give talks like this in the States, most people have no idea what's going on. So maybe you don't. This is another great singer-songwriter, Lucinda Williams. But what's happening here is really important, because we did have that kind of well-oiled system in the US for quite a long period of time. Post-World War II, the Great Society, government was making sure unions had rights and had regulations, that workers were protected, that we were passing legislation that helped make it easier to get ahead in the US, and that people who are playing by the rules got a fair share. So that's what we're kind of seeing here. We had productivity, which is so important, because as an economist, we think it's increases in productivity that give us the real gains in standard of living, the way we actually live. And we know that the standard of living was really growing in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So you have to think about this. The economy is growing, like the economic pie is getting much bigger. Workers can make more widgets faster. So what this usually meant, up until the 70s anyway, is that corporations did better, businesses did better, but workers also got part of that gain, right? When everybody was doing better, workers took part of their fair share. And unions were there to make sure that happened. And in hand with the government to some extent. But then it looks like, and this is actually what happened, a technical term here, all hell broke loose in the 1970s and 80s, right? We clearly see that something wrong has gone on here. Because since the 70s, the economy in the US has doubled. Doubled, that's a lot of income. And it's important to think about, when we're thinking through these slides in this presentation, the backdrop of this is that we're like the richest country in the world, which you would never know that now. But so you have the economy expanding, productivity going through the roof, some of the most productive workers in the world, but yet their wages and their compensation, meaning their benefits, health care, because of course, you know, we don't get that. It's not easy to get health care in the US, especially during this time frame. So wages and benefits stagnant. Stagnant. So where's all that extra income going? And of course, I think you know the answer. The extra income is going to the top, flowing more and more, faster and faster, disproportionately to those at the top. So during this little period when we had Occupy Wall Street a few years ago, that was so, for a lot of us more progressives, we were so happy, because I've been talking about this since I became an economist. It's gone mostly unnoticed to Americans. They just weren't questioning it. But this is what came to light, that over about 3 decades, you have the benefits going to the top 1% disproportionately, almost 3 times the rate of the rest of the country. And so what does this mean? The economy is growing, there's a lot more income, it's flowing to the top. I guess there's no surprise. And I just want to say one thing. So these data are a little bit out of date, because we always have to, data lag behind. But the most recent data has shown, since the economy started rolling again, post-Great Recession, started going in about 2009, we came out of it. We've been growing at a very tepid rate, but we are growing. The new data shows that we're worse coming out of the Great Recession than we were going into it, which is really disturbing. 121% of the recent gains in the economy have gone to the top 1%. So they've taken it all and then some. They've taken it all and then some. So it doesn't look very promising moving forward. So there's no surprise here that this decline in middle-class incomes goes hand in hand with our massive decline in unionization. Back in the 60s, we had 1 in 3 that were in unions. This graph starts around the 70s. So the green is union membership here, all the way falling, and with it, the middle class share of income. So of all the income that goes to the broad middle class, they keep getting a smaller and smaller and smaller share. So what do we have? Today we have private sector, and I know Dr. Foote was talking some about this in his great presentation. The share of private sector unionization, below 7%. Even the public sector, about 35%. For an overall unionization rate and representation in the U.S. of about 12.5% and falling. There's nothing that's going to stop this that I can see in the U.S. right now. Matter of fact, post-Great Recession, things have gotten, again, like I said, a lot worse, not just with income, but in policies. So right-to-work legislation that I know is knocking on your door was dormant for the most part in the U.S. for decades. We had about 20 states or so that were right to work. The other ones weren't. They stayed that way for decades. Since the Great Recession, we've had 2 states, Michigan and Indiana, in union stronghold Rust Belt that are now right to work. And this is nothing but bad news for workers. And again, I'm speaking as a working class kid that's pro-union, but what I know about economics has only made me more pro-union, because I see that workers in the US are not getting a fair shake, and I don't see anything turning that around in the near future. We also had these fights around right to work in places like Wisconsin. I'm sure you probably heard a little bit of what was going on in Wisconsin. It was just crazy down there. And one thing that happened that was surprising, maybe not so surprising, is that the powers that be, mostly governors, started pitting private sector workers against public sector workers. And the private sector workers were biting. They were saying, well, I don't have health care. Why should you have health care? I don't have a pension. Why should you have a pension? And of course, it's their taxpayer dollars that are paying for this. So they think they're fighting the good fight against workers. And I would say, why are you thinking that way? Why don't you think? Why do you have a pension? Why do you have good health care? And how do I get that? I need a union. I need a union. That's what I need. I need a collective voice to make sure I get my fair share. But unfortunately, this is still lost on many Americans because we have a real anti-union slant, a real anti-union sentiment. And I hope that we can change it. And we're working hard to do that. But I'm not all that hopeful at this time, because I thought at the worst of the Great Recession that maybe this is what we needed, you know, like a drug addict or something. We need to bottom out, and then we'll come roaring back. And in some respects we had, and in others we haven't. But we have this idea that the upper classes want us all to keep believing in this American dream that is becoming more like folklore. And so, how much of it is really true? And I just want to show you some good economic analysis that other people did. But this is just basically following families over time. Because we really want to believe in the U.S. that class doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you start. You can do anything. Anybody can become wealthy. But what the new data are showing that that's simply not true. As a matter of fact, where you start is becoming more of a predictor of where you'll end than it used to. So mobility is less. So what this simply does is it takes a bunch of people in the 20 percentile or less, so pretty poor folks, and it tracks these families over time. And then it says, where did they end up, maybe 10 years later? And what this is showing you, that those who started in the bottom, these yellow lines, these yellow bars, that almost all of them stayed in the bottom. You started in the bottom, you stayed in the bottom. This would be mobility. This would be making it to the top. Almost no one does, right? So then, if we look over time to the people who started in the top and then try to figure out where they ended, again, the same kind of situation. You started in the top, you stayed in the top. We simply do not have the rate of economic mobility that we would like to believe that we do. Of course, one reason that we don't is because the people kind of telling the story are people who are on an economic ladder that looks like this, right? I kind of started, and of course, even these people who are born very wealthy, they give themselves so much credit. You know, those job creators, the people who are building their own roads and bridges. No, they don't even ever think that they depend on government. They depend on infrastructure. They depend on public investments to make their businesses work so they can do what they want, so they can go to the good schools that they go to. So the part of the problem is a lot of Americans believe their ladder looks like this when it actually doesn't. And so it's really hard to get beyond this notion of class. And so the prospects have rarely been better in the US than they are today for the very wealthy and privileged class. I mean, after all, we're going to talk a little bit about the job market, but we're still in a jobs crisis, right? Massive unemployment. Massive amount of people, 10 million, have just disappeared from the labor force, making our high unemployment rate actually artificially low. But what happened to the Dow? The Dow's flirting with 15,000? 15,000. And this is just shameful. This week, maybe you heard that Ben Bernanke has decided that maybe he'll start easing the quantitative easing. So the quantitative easing is just all the free money that the bankers and the financiers have been getting since the implosion of the economy, since we bailed them out, and they're doing really well. And so what they do, when they heard about Bernanke going to bring down and start, pulling back on all the free money, they had a little hissy fit, and they blew the markets up, and they tanked at 300 or 400 points that day. This is what they do, right? They completely tank the economy because they're crying, I want my free money, right? And so then, like the next day, the GDP report comes out, right? The gross domestic product of the US, and we thought it was growing by 2.5%, which would be pretty good. Decent, not great, but at least the unemployment rate wouldn't continue to go up. We'd be creating just enough jobs to keep things about even, right? The revisions came out the next day after they were crying. The revisions were 1.8%. Now we've gone from kind of okay to lousy. The market soared because this goes to show you the Main Street, Wall Street split has never been greater. And they don't care about the rest of America. They absolutely don't care. Their actions show it. It's not even my opinions. Their actions show it. They don't care if they tank the rest of the economy as long as their markets are going up, even if it is probably another bubble because of all this free money they've been getting for years. They just don't care about the rest of the US economy, which is why they need to be so highly regulated and still aren't, even after they took down the US economy and half the world with them. So, but when we're talking about mobility, in the US we think, okay, let's step back. One way you can get ahead is education, right? But of course we're dismantling that too, because motivation met opportunity in the Great Recession, and we're pulling back all of our public investments, all of our public funds, because now we can't afford it. But again, I always say this in the dropback of we are still the richest country in the world and will continue to be. But all of a sudden, after all those bailouts and all the money we've spent on the wealthy, we have no money left for poor people, for old people, for people who want to go to school, good schools. So this is kind of fascinating, and it is really wasted talent, and it really pushes back against any kind of meritocracy that we have in the US. And this is just following kids who took an 8th grade math test, okay? So we know that these kids, all of these kids scored poorly on the 8th grade math test. And then they followed them into adulthood, and they saw which ones, at what rate that they got a college degree, that rate they got a BA degree, right? And so you see what happens is these are poor kids, middle-income kids, and the yellow here are rich kids. But all of them scored poorly. But the rich kids were more far likely to get a BA degree than the poor kids, right? This really pushes back against a meritocracy. So you have this at all of these three levels of scores, right? So here's middle score for the three groups of kids and the high scoring. But the takeaway really is, I hate to say it this way, but it's the only way you can really say it, is that you have these kind of dumb rich kids, and they're getting college degrees at the same rate as very, very smart poor kids. We're leaving a lot of talent on the ground, especially when you consider that over 1 in 5 children in the US live in poverty. Those are a lot of kids that are never going to see their full potential in the United States. Never. And instead of moving us forward with their talents, many will be a burden because they'll live in poverty probably forever. So this, again, is an example of what we're talking about, the idea of class, meritocracy, and mobility. So Americans hate this next slide. I'll just tell you this, and part of it's because of you. But when we talk about mobility, the US has much less than we like to think, again. The longer, you don't need to know about this. All you need to know is this study says the longer the bar, the less mobility, the shorter the bar, the more mobility. And there's Canada right up there. So you have a lot more mobility than we do. Part of the reason is, though, that our economic ladders, if you will, are fundamentally different, right? Our economic ladder has a lot of people dangling just to hold on to the bottom. And now a lot of people slipping from the rungs of the middle-class rungs that they thought they had a firm footing on, and they're slipping, trying to hold on. And the safety nets aren't there. Then the top rungs, well, you can't even traverse them because there's so much space in between them and everyone else. And we have to keep building rungs higher and higher on the US economic ladder to make sure that the handful of very extremely wealthy people have their rungs way at the top. So again, when I was looking at some of these data, you have this idea that Americans, we are number one, we are number one. And they're totally baffled when I tell them the U.S. has some of the developed countries, the U.S. has the highest, some of the lowest life expectancy in the developed world, the highest infant mortality in the developed world, and of course the highest child poverty rates. But so many of us just refuse to accept it. Now, when I was also looking through the data, I found this, which I thought was a little telling. And so these are the amount of national income that the top 1% controls. So in the US, it's over 20%, and these data are, again, the data lag behind, so you don't have right up-to-date data, but the US made this turn into the top 1%, gaining more and more and more of their share of income a long time ago, certainly before Canada. The United Kingdom, Thatcherism had the same type of outcome, but I was surprised to see Canada up here. Now, the most recent data for Canada is a couple of years behind, about 2007. I couldn't find the most recent. So I don't know if this kind of still continues to level off or if it's going to start to increase. But I thought it could be a troubling sign, as I know that you're experiencing a lot of the same pressures that we are. So I talked about this well-oiled system, these checks and balances should be happening, that I'm arguing is completely broken down in the US. So what do we have in the US? What we have in the US is this vicious cycle. This vicious cycle where the wealthy buy the politicians and the policies that they want. They buy political access through just giving money to the candidates they want. I mean, we had one person, a very rich person, Sheldon Adelson, right, a big billionaire from Las Vegas, kept Newt Gingrich in the presidential race for a long time just because he personally kept writing out checks. And this is an insane form of governance, right? All this money. So The wealthy beget political access through direct funding of campaigns, both Democrats and Republicans, and through lobbying, right? Through lobbying. Lobbying, to me, it's amazing to me that the anti-union sentiment and the scorn with which a lot of Americans look at unions. Because what is lobbying? I mean, you don't look at lobbying, you don't hear the Citibank lobby, right? You don't hear the Morgan Stanley lobby. You hear of what? The financial lobby. The financial lobby is what? It's a bunch of finance companies and banks putting their money together, sending their representatives to Washington, D.C., to do their bidding, to get the policies they want. Isn't that a union by any other name? But I'm not sure why they get such a break. So the political access begets the policies that begets the wealthy, even more wealth. And now we're in this vicious cycle of what I would call closer to a plutocracy than a democracy. We are governed by, for the 1%, and we have basically the levers of government in the United States are now being pulled by the very wealthy. And the fine line that should exist between our government and our wealthy is very, very blurred, if there's one left at all. So all of this is couched in this free market ideology that also now has become this really kind of US, we are US, we're number one deal. Everybody always talks about the free market, like it comes down from on high, from somewhere. But there's no free market. The free market is what we make it. We are the government. We're supposed to be government representatives. We make the rules and the regulations by which our market system, which, by the way, is a mixed market, right? We have some free market ideas. We have mixed market. For instance, most people do believe unemployment benefits should be given to the unemployed. Well, that's not the free market. The free market would say you lost your job, you're on your own. So we do have this mixed system that most Americans don't want to kind of believe in anyway. So to really understand what's going on in the US, you have to kind of read Ayn Rand. I mean, she landed in our country and people are still talking about her. The right especially loves her. This idea of, the lower classes are basically parasites and the free market and the rich should run the world for everyone. But I always talk about this. This is simply marginal tax rates. So that's the last dollar that rich people make. That's what they pay on that dollar, marginal tax rates. I mean, is this from the free market? I don't think so. This is a bunch of rich people that are now making the rules for themselves, and they think they should pay lower taxes, and so they do. Another really kind of funny thing about this graph is right here is the Bush tax cuts. That's what the Bush tax cuts were, right? We're talking about, so we had all of this debate and discourse. Oh, should the marginal rate be 35% or 39%, 35 or 39? Of course, they loved that we kept the debate in this little narrow range, right? Because why the hell weren't we saying, why shouldn't they be 50% or 60% or 70% or, God forbid, 90%? But that was never even discussed in the US. So we made a little bit of, now they're going up to somewhere around 44%. But in the end, again, it doesn't matter, right? Because rich people make all their money through capital gains. They're paying about 15%. That's why you have someone extremely wealthy like Mitt Romney and Warren Buffett that paid an effective tax rate of below 14%. Well, most Americans, middle-class Americans, pay higher rates than multi-billionaires. So again, this is just more of the same. This is going from talking about income to wealth, because again, capital gains is wealth. It's not income that they're making, it's what they're making on their investments. And this is really what's happened since the implosion of the housing market for the average Americans who have most of their wealth in their homes, who have lost it. This is over, a 30-year period. And what we see is that the wealth of these bottom households is less today than 1983. This is in real terms. This is taking into account price changes. The wealth of American households at the bottom is less 3 decades later. Unbelievable. So these red bars are the top 20% broken out. So when you think of an economic wealth pie that has grown since the early 80s, 75% of those gains went to the top 5%. So again, we do not have what Americans like to think is a rising tide lifting all boats, and that tide keeps rising. We have people now becoming very wealthy at the expense of everyone else in the country. And that's why the economic ladder for many in the US now looks like this, instead of the first one that I showed you. Wealth is declining, wages are stagnating at best. Do you know that for male workers especially, from the 50th percentile, those in the middle, all the way to the bottom, so this is just not a story of low-wage workers, are making less today than they were 3 decades ago. Making less today than they were 3 decades ago. As the tax burden has shifted onto the backs of workers. As corporations pay no taxes. I mean, we have ExxonMobil, quarter after quarter, reporting record billions profits, and they pay 0 taxes to the federal government, thus again starving our public system and our public institutions. So the last thing I want to show you is why I have been saying for years now, it's been 5.5 years since the implosion. We're officially, last month, June, marked 4 years of economic recovery. 4 years of economic recovery. And I just want to show you how bad things really are in the US. This is basically the 1981 recession, one of the deepest recessions we've ever had. So this chart just shows you, as a recession starts at point 0, at some point recession starts, and as you would expect, we start to lose jobs. So we lose jobs, we bottom out, that's right here. The star is the official end of the recession that doesn't always track the job market. And then you start regaining jobs again. And then at some point, and in the 1981 recession, it was about 26 months later, we regained the jobs we lost, and we continue then on our jobs recovery. That's what a typical recession used to look like. Then we had the 1991 recession, and you probably started hearing these jobless recoveries. That's when the recessions would be over, but it would take forever to get the jobs back, right? A long, long time to recoup these jobs. In the 2001 recession, again, relatively short recession, only 8 months, not that deep, right? Only lost about 1.9% of all jobs. Took forever, again, because we don't ever pursue the Federal Reserve's second mandate. First mandate, stabilize prices. Second mandate, you probably never heard of, full employment. It's a joke. So just to let you know where we are today, this is the Great Recession. So if you didn't think it was great, this shows you that it was pretty great. We lost over 6% of all jobs. In the private sector, we lost closer to 9%. Imagine, almost 1 in 10 private sector jobs just disappeared in the US. So this is the bottom. We've never seen anything like this. I mean, this is a catastrophe. This should be front page news even today. By the way, this is where we are today. We still have not crossed the line again. I don't know when it's going to happen. We are still about 2.5 million jobs short of where we began in December of 2007. December of 2007. Now, over this 5.5-year period, all these people have entered the workforce. New high school grads, new college grads, right? So if you factor those folks in, we are about 10 million jobs short in the US of anywhere near full employment, or otherwise an unemployment rate that is somewhere below 5%, let's say. Especially when things start getting better, the 10 million folks that just disappeared also start coming into the labor force. But nobody's talking about this. And it was about at this point here. Oh, and by the way, this little bloop here, that is the census when we did our 2010 decennial census. That is a fact that government can create jobs and should create jobs. And I kept saying at this time, we should just keep doing the census over and over and over and over again. Because we would have loved to have taken this trajectory up and not the one that we're on. But instead, at the bottom of this jobs trough, at the height of the crisis, what happens? We pivot to austerity because the markets came roaring back. They had their free money. They didn't care about anything else. We pivoted to austerity, and we said, Wall Street's fine. We don't give a shit what happens to Main Street. We're going to leave you all behind. It's 5 years later, and we're still struggling. And wages now are starting to decline even faster, and they're not just for low-wage workers. I mean, the wage of new college grads has not gone anywhere in the U.S. for the last 10 years. So again, it's not even a story of education. It's a story where the rich are becoming richer at the expense of us all. So I say to you, the times are changing. I hope you never see pictures like this up here in beautiful Canada. I would say that the economy of societies do not work without the role of unions. Without the role of unions, the world is a desperate place for workers. There is no doubt about that. So I say fight for all that you hold dear and forge the path ahead that you see and you envision for the future of Canada, because the American dream seems at least alive and well to some respect up here in Canada. Thank you.